Good evening. Good to see everyone out this evening. If you're visiting with us, we're especially glad that you're here, that you chose to worship with us this evening, and you're a welcome guest. I don't know whether to consider y'all unlucky or not. You get a double dose of Jacob today, and you get a double dose of holiday-themed lessons. So maybe lucky or unlucky, we'll see how it goes. But again, thank you for coming out. We're going to spend a few minutes looking at a little bit different kind of approach than the good lesson that we had from Jacob this morning. When I was in, I believe, the 5th grade, I got to take a trip related to a competition that we were in for school, all the way up to Boston. And as part of the trip, we took a little bit of time to go and see some of the things that are around Boston. There's a lot of history there. And so we spent some time at the Mayflower. We looked at a tour of the boat, spent some time there. And then we also went and looked at Plymouth Rock and even ended up at a mock Plymouth village or colony. And we went there, and as kids, we got to spend time walking around what the village looked like, seeing what were actors and actresses portraying what that life looked like back at that time. And I remember as a kid thinking, oh, this looks kind of cool. This looks, I could churn butter, I could swing a hammer. This looks easy, this looks fun. But as a kid, I didn't have a great understanding of history. And so if you go and look at a lot of the history, you realize Pilgrim life was not that easy. Pilgrim life was not that fun. And it was a lot of strength and courage that needed to do what those individuals did. Pilgrims, just for a little bit of history here, they journeyed to the Americas in the 1600s, but they first broke away from the Church of England and actually moved to the Netherlands. And they spent some time there, kind of known as the separatists at that point. They had separated themselves from some of the things that the Church of England were doing. And then in about 1620, several of those separatists, along with a few others who were wanting to leave England at that time, a little over 100 people left on the Mayflower. And after about 66 days of sailing through tough weather, all sorts of hardships, they landed off the coast of Massachusetts at what would be known as Plymouth Rock. And there they established the Plymouth colony, but the Pilgrims, they suffered quite greatly, especially during that first cold winter. Ultimately, they lost over half of the people that came over from different kind of sickness and disease. In the next year, they made a treaty with the local Native Americans who helped them show how to kind of survive in the land, plant crops. And this starts to get into the story that we all know as what becomes the first Thanksgiving, in which they end up celebrating with those that helped them for the things and gave thanks for a successful crop after they had been there a little while. And that usually becomes our focus, right? We tend to think about, okay, this is where the first Thanksgiving came from. And we think about, oftentimes we forget about what the Pilgrims actually had to endure, or what it even means, or why they were called Pilgrims. In our own lives, oftentimes, our views towards the Christian life is very focused on our own here and now. And rightly so, we focus on how a Christian life affects our marriage, how it affects our secular jobs, roles as parents, and just your day-to-day life on this earth. Sometimes if we're not careful, we can view heaven as, hey, that's a nice benefit at the end. Nice benefit of living this Christian life here, and we lose sight of what it really means to pursue it as our true home. If not careful, we no longer view ourselves as pilgrims. And so in this time of year of thinking about the things that God has blessed us with, and we had a great lesson this morning about that grace and gratitude and the generosity we should have, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about a pilgrim mindset and pilgrim pursuits. So if you would go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. So I think there's a few things that we can look at that are related to a pilgrim's mindset that can help us as we continue our life and our journey here. First of all, pilgrims are strange. The use of word, let's go ahead and read in verse 13 of Hebrews chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. And depending on your translation, there may be several words here besides stranger. It could be sojourner, alien, foreigner, just to name a few. Throughout the Bible, these words were a common way for God to describe his people. In fact, these words, stranger, sojourner, alien, foreigner, or exile, appear quite frequently throughout. Stranger appears approximately 59 times, according to the ESV version. Foreigner, 98 times. Sojourner, 49 times. Alien, 16. Exiles, 41. And while these words have application for both the people inside and outside of a relationship with God, many times, as is the case here in Hebrews, this word is used to express the mindset we should have as God's people here on earth. Okay, so then what does it mean to be a stranger, to be strange? Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. In verse 9, we read, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you have not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." We're strange because God has chosen us. We are God's chosen people for his own possession, a chosen race. And it was like this from the beginning. Since at the time of Abraham, God's people were set apart, different from the nations all around them. Most of the Old Testament is dedicated towards this relationship, to which God had called his people to be separate. And time after time, those people are no longer different or strange, but instead want to be like all the other nations around them. And as Christians, we too are called to be different, to be separate from the world, to be strange. Look over in Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12, a verse familiar for a lot of us. Verse 2, it says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." We're called to be different, right? Not to be like this world, but to be transformed and different from it, to be strange. And so strange also means that we should be okay with the uncomfortable, or comfortable with discomfort is kind of how I think about it. How many of you have been in a situation where you knew you just didn't belong or fit in? We don't have to show a set of hands here, but my guess is that's pretty common for all of us. Whether it's traveling to a foreign country where there's a different language being spoken and an unfamiliarity all around you, whether it's moving to a new city or a new state where you don't know anyone, or starting a new job or new school. How do these situations typically make you feel? If you're like me, you likely feel awkward and uncomfortable. And typically, that's a feeling we try to avoid or quickly replace, right? But as Christians, we need to embrace the awkward, embrace discomfort, be strange. If we find ourselves feeling too comfortable it probably means we should evaluate whether we're really having this pilgrim mindset. Turn over to Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12. We see an example here, I think, that shows kind of the opposite for us. In Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 13, it says, "Someone in the crowd said to him, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me.' But he said to him, 'Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?' And he said to them, 'Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions.' And he told them a parable, saying, 'The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" I know the idea here is around covetousness and where your heart is. But I think what we see here in that rich fool's mindset is one in which he thought about the things of this world and what it could provide him. He thought, how am I going to be content here? How am I going to be comfortable and content on this earth? And because of that mindset, he's called a fool. And so as pilgrims, we need to ask ourselves, are we too content here? Are we comfortable with discomfort? Are we strange? Second, pilgrims have courage. As we just talked about, being a pilgrim means being a stranger in new situations. And as such, we have to have courage to face the unknown. And it's a stressful thing when we don't know what the outcome's going to be, right? When it's uncertain what will happen, we get anxiety, stress. We feel like we don't know what's going to go on. We see a lot of examples throughout the Bible of how people who were in these situations had the courage to go into the unknown. For instance, Abraham. As we kind of read just a minute ago in Hebrews, in the Hall of Faith, it's talking about Abraham. In verse 8, it says, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going." Abraham leaves his home, his family, everything he had to seek after an unknown land, after a promise that he was given. And it took a tremendous amount of faith and courage to do so. We see an example with the disciples of Jesus. Over in Luke chapter 10, this is when Jesus is sending out some of his disciples, the 72, to go out and help prepare. And it says in verse 1 through 3, "After this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them on ahead of him, 2 by 2, into every town and place where he himself was about to go. And he said to them, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go your way. Behold, I am sending you out as lambs in the midst of wolves.'" These disciples were being sent out ahead of Jesus to preach and teach about his coming, not knowing exactly what they would face, just that it would be like lambs in the midst of wolves. And yet, they went out. And we read a short while after that, they came back, returning in joy that they were able to do what Christ had asked them. Another example is Paul on his missionary journeys. I've been studying this in the high school class, and we see throughout Paul facing the unknown. Turn over to Acts chapter 20, verse 22. Acts chapter 20. In verse 22, it reads, "And now, behold, I'm going to Jerusalem, constrained by the Spirit, not knowing what will happen to me there, except that the Holy Spirit testifies to me in every city that imprisonment and affliction awaits But I do not account my life of any value, nor as precious to myself, if only I may finish my course and the ministry that I received from the Lord Jesus, to testify to the gospel of the grace of God. For years, Paul journeyed to new cities, to unknown lands, often facing imprisonment, beatings, persecution, danger, threats on his life. And despite the uncertainty that awaited him, he courageously faced each of these hardships everywhere he went, preaching the gospel. So we, as pilgrims, have courage facing the unknown, but we also have courage facing the cares of this world. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2. Back to 1 Peter chapter 2. Reading in verse 11, says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when you speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." Being here in this world as pilgrims means we're still going to be tempted by those things all around us. Yet we're called to abstain, called to flee from them, called to be separate from the things of this world. Instead, we should be keeping our conduct, our actions, honorable and pure. Why? Because while we are pilgrims here, our good deeds and our actions serve as an example to those all around us to God's glory. And the last pursuit of a pilgrim I want to look at tonight is that pilgrims have a destination. Pilgrims aren't aimless wanderers. A lot of times we think of that word and how it's used, and we associate it maybe to pilgrims. And I think it can be misleading because while the journey to where they may be going is not known, the destination is clear. Going back into Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8. It says, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God." Abraham's destination was clear. It's described as, 1, an inheritance, 2, a land of promise, and then as a city with foundations, designed and built by God. Our destination is clear. It's no different. It's this everlasting city built by God for us to call home. So having that clear destination also means we shouldn't look back. A pilgrim's focus must always be on the destination. Continuing in Hebrews 11, now in verse 13, it says, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city." Our heart follows where we are placing our focus. If Abraham had kept his mind on the land in which he came from, where he left, then that would have presented his heart an opportunity to return. Another example that we can see of this maybe longing or thought process to return to where we came is with the Israelites. If you look in Exodus chapter 16, in Exodus chapter 16, verse 2, it says, "And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, 'Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out here in the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger.'" And this isn't very long after they had just fled Egypt. And in just a short time, the Israelites' focus came off their destination and back to the land which they had gone out from, even romanticizing the way things had been in Egypt. We sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. How quickly they forget the bondage, the persecution, the hardships that they endured while in Egypt. And if we're not careful, we can have the same mindset, romanticizing the things of this world, losing sight of our destination, losing sight of what's called the better country, a heavenly one, a place that God has prepared for us. Looking back at the pilgrims that first came to America, I don't think there was anything easy about their journey. Being a pilgrim, unlike my 5th grade self, it looks like it was hard. And having this mindset is hard for us today. However, here on this earth, it's what we're called to be. And that means as pilgrims, we must be comfortable with being strange. We must have courage in our journey. And our focus needs to be on the ultimate destination, a city prepared for his people, a city with foundations, whose designer and builder is God. There may be those here this evening that have started on this pilgrim journey, and by becoming his child in baptism. And if you haven't started that journey, tonight is an opportunity to begin. There may also be those who have been struggling with thinking of that land which they have gone out, struggling with certain cares of this world, distractions, struggling with being strange, being different, and not keeping their mind on the ultimate destination. Whatever your need may be, we encourage